If you ask the old-timers of the New Forest about the November storm that year, they'll tell you it came out of nowhere, like the forest itself was trying to wash away the past. Lightning clawed at the sky, wind bent the ancient oaks until their branches screamed, and rain slammed down so hard it erased all traces of the narrow country lane. At the heart of that chaos stood Lady Charlotte Whitmore, half hidden behind the shattered windows of her once proud Georgian estate. Her eyes shadowed and restless as she watched the world fall apart. She'd been a doctor once, one of the best, people said, an A&E consultant in London, unshakable even on the worst nights. That was before her world broke, before the mountain, before Edward. She flinched, gripping the windowsill so hard her knuckles turned white. She didn't go there. Not anymore. She'd built walls as thick as the ones encircling her estate. Kept everyone out, including her own family. Especially her own family. Tonight, though, the storm wouldn't let her hide. A thunderclap rattled the glass, the lights flickered, then died. Only the sullen glow of the fireplace held the darkness at bay. Charlotte stepped away from the window, her reflection vanishing. She lit a lantern, habit and training taking over, her movements precise, efficient, almost angry. She'd just set the lantern down when she heard it. A shrill, panicked whinny from somewhere beyond the garden, carried by the wind. She froze. Horses had always been her brother's domain, not hers. But something about that sound, raw, wild, desperate, refused to let her ignore it. She tried to push it away, but it clawed at her, reminding her of nights in the Lake District, when Edward's laughter would echo through the woods and everything still made sense. Damn it. Charlotte threw on her waxed jacket and heavy boots, yanked open the door, and stepped into the storm. The rain stabbed at her face, cold and relentless, drenching her hair and soaking her jeans in seconds. She moved on instinct, following the sound through the tangled hedges and down toward the Lymington River. The river, usually so tame and narrow, had burst its banks, turning the meadow into a black, swirling lake. Her boots sank in mud with every step, but she pressed on, the wind screaming in her ears. Another shriek, closer now. In the sickly light of her lantern, Charlotte spotted him, a pony, chestnut with wild white markings, flailing in the torrent, his mane plastered to his neck, eyes rolling with terror, hooves slamming against the current as if he could pound the river into submission. One of the wild New Forest ponies. Edward would have known exactly what to do. But Edward wasn't here. She stopped at the edge of the water, her heart hammering in her chest, torn between training and trauma. Go back, something inside her whispered. You can't save him. You can't even save yourself. But the animal's head slipped beneath the water for a moment, and that voice was drowned out by another, fierce, furious, the voice that had once fought to save lives against impossible odds. Move! Charlotte scrambled down the bank, her boots nearly lost to the sucking mud. The water surged around her knees, icy enough to burn. The pony thrashed wildly as she waded closer, his fear contagious. Easy. Easy, boy, she called, her voice steadier than she felt. I'm here. I won't let you drown. He tried to bolt, but a half-submerged branch had snagged his foreleg, pinning him fast. Charlotte's medical brain kicked in. Evaluate, act. She inched forward, water now at her waist, rain blinding her. The current threatened to sweep her legs out from under her, but she clung to a root, inch by inch, until she reached him. His whole body quivered with exhaustion and terror. Lightning shattered the night again, close enough that she felt the hairs on her arms lift. The river surged, dragging at the pony. He kicked out in panic, and one hoof clipped Charlotte's side. Pain bloomed through her ribs, sharp and deep, but she clamped her jaw shut. No time. She freed the rope from her jacket pocket, a habit from years in the field, one Edward had teased her about endlessly, and looped it around the pony's neck. "Come on, Windsor," she grunted, naming him in that mad moment after the forest's royal roots. "You're not dying here, and neither am I." He fought her, wild and uncomprehending, nearly pulling her under twice. She dug deep, thinking of every lost soul in A&E, every last-ditch effort when everyone else had given up. Slowly, she freed his trapped leg, never letting go of the rope. She could feel her strength fading, her injured side screaming in protest, but she refused to let go. Finally, miraculously, the branch gave way. The current yanked them both downstream. Charlotte slammed against a stone, lost her grip on the lantern, and for a terrifying second, everything was darkness and cold, and the certainty that this was how it ended. No. She grabbed the rope with numb fingers, kicked furiously, and together they broke free, tumbling onto the muddy far bank. Charlotte lay gasping, rain soaking her face, body shuddering from pain and adrenaline. The pony, Windsor, collapsed beside her, sides heaving. For a long, shivering moment, neither moved. Then slowly, he lifted his head, met her gaze, and something silent passed between them. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched his neck. "You made it," she whispered, not sure if she meant him, herself, or the ghosts that still haunted her. The storm raged on, but somewhere inside Charlotte Whitmore a new fight had begun. This wasn't just about saving a pony. It was about facing the river she'd run from for too long. And the wild, battered thing beside her might just be the one to pull her back from the edge. The world had turned to chaos, a wild symphony of rain, wind, and the thunderous surge of the Lymington River. Lady Charlotte Whitmore pressed her cheek to the mud, breath ragged, her side pulsing with a deep, insistent ache. She had done it. Against every rational voice, against the sharp pain and the biting cold, she had dragged both herself and the wild pony out of the river's jaws. But the storm wasn't finished with them. Overhead, lightning ripped apart the clouds, casting sharp, strobe-like flashes that lit the forest in stark whites and deep, writhing shadows. The rain kept falling, relentless, as if the sky itself wanted to wash them from the face of the earth. The chestnut pony, Windsor, lay stretched out beside her, sides heaving, nostrils wide with panic. For a heartbeat, Charlotte worried he'd bolt and vanish into the blackness, leaving her alone again, shivering, battered, questioning if any of this mattered. But Windsor only snorted and tried to rise, legs buckling, mud caking his mane and belly. He struggled and fell again, trembling violently. Charlotte's own body screamed with exhaustion, and her left rib throbbed where the pony's hoof had caught her. But somewhere deeper inside, beyond the clinical knowledge, beyond even the survivor's stubbornness, she felt a flicker of something that had lain dormant for years. Not hope exactly, but the primal drive to protect, to heal, to not let loss win again. She pushed herself up, boots squelching, one hand clutching her side. The river was rising fast, licking at their feet, swirling with debris, branches, garbage, even the slick flash of a half-drowned fox scrambling for higher ground. "We have to move, Windsor," she whispered, unsure if she spoke to him or herself. "We have to go, now." She glanced upstream, spotting the distant, ghostly outline of her lantern wedged against a rock, the flame extinguished, a lost star in the deluge. The estate wasn't far, but the path had vanished beneath water and mud. Charlotte pulled at the rope looped around Windsor's neck, gentle but insistent, her hands numb, rainwater running down her sleeves. The pony braced his legs, eyes wild with fear, but something about her voice, or maybe the simple presence of another living soul, steadied him. Step by agonizing step, she led him along the bank, feet slipping, adrenaline burning through fatigue. Behind her, the forest hissed and whispered, old oaks creaking in protest, the wind carrying distant shouts. Maybe a neighbor, maybe only the ghosts of memory. Edward's voice sometimes haunted her in moments like this, urging her on, warning her, teasing her in that warm, infuriating way only a little brother could. She blinked back the memory, forcing her focus to the present. A sudden gust nearly knocked her sideways, the rope jerking in her grip as Windsor spooked, rearing up, hooves flailing inches from her face. "Whoa, whoa, Windsor, easy!" She ducked, mud splattering her cheek, heart hammering. She wrapped her arms around the pony's neck, feeling his whole body quake. The smell of wet fur, sweat, and fear filled her lungs, grounding her. "You're okay, I promise," she said, her voice lower, steadier than she felt. The two staggered forward, weaving between gnarled tree roots, ducking low branches. Each step was a battle, her boots slipping, Windsor's hooves sinking deep, the rope chafing raw against her palm. She could barely see the outline of the stable through the curtain of rain. She thought about yelling for help, but who would come? She had driven everyone away, even the staff. Only the storm would hear her now. A flash of movement made her freeze. Something, someone, stood at the edge of the estate. Lantern held high. For a split second, Charlotte's heart leapt. Edward? But reality snapped back. Just a pair of wide, startled eyes, a neighbor's teenage son in a yellow slicker, staring at the spectacle, an aristocratic lady and a wild pony stumbling out of the tempest. "Go home!" Charlotte shouted over the wind. "It's dangerous out here. Get inside!" The boy hesitated, then bolted, his silhouette swallowed by the darkness. Finally, the stable doors loomed ahead, weathered, half off their hinges, but standing. Charlotte fumbled with the latch, shoving with her shoulder, mud sloughing from her jeans. "Come on, Windsor, in you go!" The pony balked at first, but another roll of thunder sent him skittering inside, nearly knocking her over. The smell of hay and old wood was a blessing, almost sacred. She slammed the door, collapsed against it, and for a long moment just let herself breathe. Windsor paced, head tossing, flanks slick with blood and river mud. Charlotte moved on autopilot, removing the rope, soothing him with a voice she barely recognized as her own. "You're safe now. I've got you. Just breathe." She flicked on the emergency generator, a small miracle she'd forced herself to install the year after Edward died, and dim yellow light spilled into the gloom. She collapsed onto a crate, ribs stabbing with every breath, hands shaking. Windsor circled the stall, restless, eyes following her. The full weight of what she'd just done began to press down. She could have died. He could have died. She could have let him drown, and no one would have blamed her. The thought twisted inside her. She was a Whitmore. She was supposed to be strong. But strength, she realized, sometimes meant running into the storm instead of hiding from it. Rain drummed a steady rhythm on the roof, thunder receding into the distance. Charlotte exhaled, feeling the cold set in. She moved to Windsor's side, examining him. His leg bled sluggishly from the scrape, a gash on his shoulder already swelling. Her own shirt was torn, ribs swelling under her palm, but she ignored the pain. "We're a fine pair, aren't we?" she murmured, pulling the old medical kit from the wall, a battered green case, untouched since. She flinched, but opened it anyway, hands moving with long-lost precision. In the wavering light, she washed Windsor's wounds, whispering nonsense and half-remembered lullabies from childhood. Each touch, each quiet word, steadied her heart a little more. She wrapped his leg, ignoring her own throbbing side, and for a brief moment, as the storm finally began to weaken, she allowed herself to hope. Maybe she had saved Windsor. Maybe, just maybe, she could save herself. And as she sank down in the straw, rain still beating at the roof and the world still roaring outside, Charlotte realized this was only the beginning. The river hadn't won. The storm had not claimed them. Whatever came next, she would face it, one muddy, wild, impossible step at a time. The old stables hadn't seen this kind of life in years. Dust and silence had ruled since the last of the Whitmore horses were sold off, their tacks still hanging from pegs like ghosts in the half-light. Charlotte stood in the center aisle, breathing in the scent of wet earth, hay, and something raw, a living animal in distress. Windsor's hooves shifted restlessly on the straw, his sides rising and falling in jerky, uneven waves. The storm outside still spat rain, but here under the ancient beams and the patched tin roof, it felt almost safe. For the first time in so long, the walls didn't close in on Charlotte. Instead, they seemed to expand, making space for a second chance. She hauled over an old oil drum, using it as a makeshift seat, and tugged the battered medical kit onto her knees. Her hands trembled, not just from cold, but from memory. The last time she'd touched this kit, she'd been in the Lake District, standing over her brother's body, blood soaking through gauze that never had a chance. The weight of it pressed down, thick as the November fog, but she forced herself to open the lid. She wouldn't let herself freeze now, not when a life still hung in the balance. Windsor watched her, dark eyes wary but curious. His coat was matted with river mud, a nasty gash running along his foreleg. He shied when she moved closer, so she crouched low, speaking softly. "Easy, Windsor. I'm not here to hurt you." The name felt right, as if claiming the pony with a word could bind him, and her, to this new, fragile beginning. She offered her hand, letting him sniff her palm, then set to work, cleaning the wound with sterile water and iodine. The pony flinched, but didn't bolt. Charlotte murmured stories under her breath, about little brothers and wild rides, about summers before everything went wrong. The words steadied her fingers as she trimmed away bits of debris, wrapped the leg, and checked for other injuries. Somewhere in the process, her own pain faded into the background. She barely noticed the blood on her shirt or the swelling along her ribs. The focus, the work, pushed everything else aside. She slipped into the old rhythm: assess, act, comfort. She remembered a day years ago, riding through the New Forest with Edward, their laughter echoing under the canopy. He'd dared her to race him across a flooded ford, and she'd beaten him by a length, soaked but triumphant. That memory shimmered in the stables now, mixing with the rain and the gentle sounds of Windsor's breath. Eventually, she fetched a blanket from the tack room, tucking it over the pony's trembling back. She fished a handful of oats from a forgotten feed bin, offering them in her open palm. Windsor hesitated, then nibbled, his lips soft and ticklish. For a few minutes, the world shrank down to the small circle of lamplight, the hush of straw underfoot, the gentle brush of horsehair against her arm. But the stillness didn't last. A branch scraped against a window, startling both of them. Windsor tossed his head, ears flicking back. Charlotte's heart jumped, but she caught herself stroking his neck. "It's okay. It's just the wind," she whispered, her voice echoing the words she'd wished someone would say to her during her darkest hours. She glanced down at her hands, smeared with mud and blood, and let herself smile. A real, aching smile she hadn't felt in months. Later, she stretched out on a pile of old feed sacks, refusing to leave the stable. The storm had mostly blown over, but she didn't trust what waited in the quiet house. Instead, she let the night wrap around her, listening to the slow, steady rhythm of Windsor's breathing. It was almost like being a child again, safe in the dark, knowing Edward was in the next room. Except this time, she was the protector, the last Whitmore standing guard over something precious and fragile. Sleep came in snatches. She dreamed of rivers, of her brother's laugh, of the pony galloping free through a sunlit meadow. She woke before dawn, the sky outside bruised purple and gray. Windsor was standing, head low, ears pricked in her direction. She stood, wincing as the ache in her side flared. "Morning, Windsor," she greeted him, voice hoarse. "We survived the night, didn't we?" He nickered softly in response. Charlotte fed him what little oats she could find, refilled the water bucket, and brushed the worst of the mud from his coat. She checked the wound, pleased to find it no worse. She scribbled a note and left it in the kitchen for anyone who might come looking, just in case she'd disappeared in the storm, just in case her mother decided to check on her from London. Outside, the storm had left its mark. Tree limbs down, puddles filling every hollow, the riverbank raw and gouged. But here in the stable, there was a strange peace. For a fleeting moment, Charlotte almost felt like herself again. Not the ghost who haunted the empty halls of Ashford House, but the woman she'd once been. She knew it couldn't last. The world would come calling soon enough. Debts, duties, family, memories she couldn't keep locked away forever. But for now, she belonged here, in the circle of lamplight, with a wounded pony and a heart that, for the first time in years, felt just a little less broken. She pressed her forehead to Windsor's, breathing in the wild scent of rain and horse. "We're going to get through this," she promised. She didn't know if she was lying, but the words felt true as anything she'd ever said. In the fragile sanctuary of the stables, a battered doctor and a battered pony began the slow, messy work of healing, together. Dawn crept in slowly, slipping pale gold fingers through the stable's high windows, turning dust motes into fleeting stars. Charlotte sat with her back against the stall, knees drawn to her chest, half asleep but alert. Windsor dozed quietly, head low, occasionally flicking an ear at some invisible annoyance. The storm had left the new forest soaked and battered, branches tangled like wild hair. But inside these old walls, Charlotte found a kind of stillness she hadn't known in years. She watched the sunlight shift over the pony's battered coat and felt something loosen in her chest, as if grief itself could finally draw breath. The silence didn't last. The crunch of tires on gravel echoed across the yard, breaking her fragile peace. Charlotte tensed, her hand instinctively reaching for the first aid kit before she caught herself. A sleek Bentley, immaculate even in the mud, rolled to a stop by the stable doors. The driver stepped out, black coat, sensible heels, then rounded the car to open the passenger door with military precision. Lady Margaret Whitmore appeared in a flash of tailored wool and pearls, silver hair pulled back in a chignon so tight it seemed to hold up her entire frame. Her presence always filled a room, and today was no different. Charlotte stood up, brushing straw from her jeans, bracing herself for the familiar collision. love and judgment, pride and disappointment, all tangled up in a mother's eyes. Lady Margaret surveyed the stable with pursed lips, taking in Windsor's mud-splattered flanks and her daughter's disheveled appearance. "Well," she said, voice crisp as frost, "I see you haven't lost your talent for chaos, Charlotte." For a second, Charlotte wanted to laugh, but the old ache between them kept her silent. "I had to bring him in," Charlotte replied, nodding toward the pony. "He was drowning. There was no one else." Her mother's expression softened, just a shade. "You always did have a weakness for lost causes," Lady Margaret said. She moved closer, her hand briefly touching Charlotte's arm before withdrawing. "I tried to call. The lines are down. Your mobile is off, as usual. I was worried." Charlotte didn't answer. She glanced at Windsor, suddenly wishing she could hide behind the animal's broad back. Lady Margaret peered into the stall, examining the pony with a practiced eye. "He's a handsome thing, even covered in muck. Have you called the vet yet?" "Not yet," Charlotte admitted. "He's stable for now, but—" She stopped, uncertain, her confidence wavering. Lady Margaret shook her head gently. "You're still a doctor, Charlotte. You know what to do even if you refuse to admit it." She produced a folded letter from her coat pocket, extending it with a kind of ceremonial gravity. "This arrived from St. Bartholomew's. They want you back. Head of trauma. It's a prestigious offer. Even for you." The words hit Charlotte like cold water. "I told them I'm not ready," she said, voice tight. "I left for a reason." Her mother's gaze softened for real this time. "We all lost Edward, Charlotte, but you lost yourself as well. He was so proud of you. I wish you could see yourself the way he did." For a long moment, neither woman spoke. Outside, the wind stirred the treetops, sending a flock of rooks wheeling across the gray sky. Charlotte leaned against the stall, watching Windsor doze, feeling the sharp sting of memories. Edward in his Royal Marines uniform, saluting with mock seriousness at family dinners. Edward grinning as he challenged her to race through the woods. Edward's steady hand on her shoulder as she made the call that would change everything. "I can't go back," she whispered. "Not after what happened. The words stuck, thick as mud. Lady Margaret sighed, her breath fogging in the chilly air. "You think you failed him, but you didn't. Sometimes fate is just cruel." She smoothed a hand over Windsor's withers, her own movements awkward but sincere. "If you want to stay here and play nursemaid to every lost soul in the forest, then at least do it properly. Call the vet, and for God's sake, let someone help you." Charlotte didn't reply. Her mother's words settled like silt in the river, hard to shift, impossible to ignore. She focused on Windsor, brushing out the worst tangles in his mane. He leaned into her touch, solid and present in a way no memory ever could be. After a moment, Lady Margaret's phone buzzed. She frowned, glancing at the screen. "I'll be in the house. Your cousin Gerald is asking about the estate's accounts again. I suppose he thinks you've burned the place down by now." Charlotte almost smiled. "Not yet. Give me time." As Lady Margaret retreated, her heels clicking on the flagstones, Charlotte lingered in the stall. She let herself remember the last conversation with Edward before his fatal rescue mission in the Lake District. His grin as he told her not to worry, the way his voice had echoed with confidence she could never quite match. The feeling of his hand slipping from hers as she fought to save him, the certainty that she'd failed, the pain of it fresh as the day it happened. But here, with Windsor breathing quietly beside her, Charlotte felt the smallest flicker of something new. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, the beginning of letting go. She found her phone, powered it up, and dialed the local vet. Her hands were steady. Her voice, when she spoke, was almost her own. "Hello, this is Lady Charlotte Whitmore. I need your help with a rescue. Yes, I'll be here all day." She hung up and turned back to Windsor, smoothing his coat with gentle fingers. "We're not alone, you and I," she murmured, more to herself than him. Not anymore. Sunlight spread wider through the windows, warming the straw, and for a moment Charlotte could almost imagine she was home. It didn't take long for the old stable to fill with the sound of urgent voices and shuffling boots. Charlotte stood in the aisle, arms crossed tight against her chest, watching the shadows outside stretch as morning slipped into afternoon. The rain had finally stopped, but everything smelled of wet earth and moss, and the air was still charged with storm energy. The first to arrive was Dr. Beatrice Ashford, her former colleague from St. Bartholomew's. Bai always moved with a surgeon's confidence, brisk, precise, her hair clipped short, her eyes sharp behind smudged glasses. She pulled Charlotte into a brief, fierce hug, then went straight to Windsor's side, kneeling to examine the pony's wound. "You weren't kidding about needing help," Bea said, voice low. "He's in rough shape, Char." Before Charlotte could answer, the stable doors banged open again and James Hartwell entered, lugging a heavy black veterinary bag. James had the weathered look of a man who'd grown up in the forest, all broad shoulders, calloused hands, and steady, measured words. "Lady Charlotte," he greeted, nodding to her with the gentle respect country people reserve for old family names. "Let's have a look." Together, they worked in the yellow pool of lamplight, Bea taking notes while James examined Windsor with clinical focus. Charlotte helped, her own medical instincts kicking in, holding the pony steady, reporting his temperature, assessing his breathing. She couldn't help but notice the warmth in Bea's voice, the quiet competence in James's hands, the way Windsor seemed to settle, if only a little, under their collective care. But the wound was ugly, deep, and already oozing thick yellow pus. Windsor's head drooped, sweat beading along his neck, and his breath rattled in his chest. "He's running a high fever," James murmured, checking the pony's gums. "Heart rate's up. That leg's infected bad. Might be sepsis setting in." A chill ran through Charlotte. She'd heard that tone before, in emergency rooms and on mountain trails, whenever the odds turned against survival. "He's strong," she said quietly, not sure if she was reassuring James, herself, or Windsor. "He survived the river. He can fight this too." James didn't answer immediately. He opened his bag, pulling out syringes, bottles of antibiotics, wound dressings, and saline. "We can give him a shot, clean it out. But I'll be honest with you, there's no guarantee. Infection's a cruel thing. Sometimes the body just gives up." He looked at Charlotte, his eyes kind but grave. "Are you willing to do whatever it takes? This isn't going to be easy. He'll need constant care. Fluids, meds, cleaning the wound, monitoring vitals day and night. If he's going to make it, he'll need a fighter at his side." Charlotte felt her composure slipping. She had been the one in charge for so long, always the rescuer, the one everyone leaned on. Now it was her turn to face powerlessness, the possibility that even her best efforts might not be enough. Bea put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to do this alone, Charlotte. Let us help." James sedated Windsor and began to clean the wound, his movements quick but careful. Pus and blood pooled onto clean white gauze. The pony moaned and shifted, even through sedation, but Bee stroked his mane and whispered soothing nonsense. Charlotte focused on each step, sterilizing instruments, preparing antibiotics, noting every change in Windsor's breathing. She felt herself slipping into that old medical rhythm, all emotion blunted by the clarity of purpose. Still, doubt crept in. With each pulse of fever beneath Windsor's skin, Charlotte remembered the dozens of patients she'd fought for, the ones who made it and the ones who didn't. The mountain rescue with Edward had played out in the same way. Every decision crucial, every second precious, the line between hope and heartbreak, thinner than a thread. James wrapped Windsor's leg, then checked his vitals again. "I'll stay for a few hours, see how he responds," he said. "But I can't promise anything. If he makes it through the night, that'll be a good sign." A tense silence followed. Charlotte caught Bee's eye. "Thank you for coming, both of you." Her voice trembled despite herself. Bee smiled softly. "Of course. You're not as alone as you think, Charlotte." Time passed in slow waves. James explained what to watch for. Labored breathing, shivering, the color of Windsor's gums, how much water he drank. Charlotte scribbled everything into a notebook, her medical handwriting returning by instinct. Bee brewed tea on a camp stove, filling the stable with the familiar scent of home. "We'll take shifts," she said. "James has to get back to his rounds, but I'll stay tonight. You get some rest when you can." Charlotte nodded, the exhaustion catching up to her at last. She slumped onto a hay bale, watching Windsor sleep uneasily, his breath shallow, sweat still dampening his flanks. She wanted to close her eyes and disappear, but every time she drifted, fear jerked her awake. Memories of Edward, of the rescue gone wrong, of hands slipping away in the cold. As night crept in, the stables glowed with lamplight and whispered voices. Bee hummed a song she used to sing during long ER shifts, while Charlotte changed Windsor's dressings and counted heartbeats. James slipped away into the darkness with a promise to return at dawn. Alone in the hush, Charlotte ran a hand down Windsor's neck. "Hang on, boy," she murmured. "Don't leave me, too." She pressed her forehead to his, fighting tears. "I can't lose you. Not now." Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the stable doors, but Charlotte stayed right there, keeping watch, refusing to let hope slip through her hands. Not tonight. Not while there was still breath in the battered chest of the pony she'd saved from the storm. By dawn, the old stables were washed in pale blue light, streaked with gold where the sun finally fought through the rain clouds. For Charlotte, the night had stretched on forever. One endless rotation between Windsor's feverish body and the notebook of instructions James had left behind. The hours blurred into a rhythm. Check Windsor's breathing, change the damp dressing, encourage him to sip water, note the color of his gums, repeat. She dozed in short, nervous bursts, each time waking with a start, heart thudding, terrified of what she'd find. It was almost a relief when the outside world intruded. Bee nudged Charlotte's shoulder, offering a mug of strong tea. "He made it through the night," Bee said quietly, nodding at Windsor, who lay stretched in the straw, chest rising and falling with slow, shallow breaths. "That's something. But he's not out of the woods yet." Charlotte set the tea aside, kneeling by Windsor's side. The pony opened one weary eye and snorted softly. His wound was still angry and swollen, but his temperature had dropped a little. Hope flickered, fragile as spun glass. But as the day wore on, trouble came from a different direction. The first Charlotte knew of it was the crunch of tires on gravel, a sound that had haunted her since childhood, always announcing unwanted visitors. This time, it was followed by loud voices, the slam of car doors, and the sharp click of camera shutters. It was the press. Tabloid reporters, their vans plastered with logos, their faces full of hungry curiosity. Someone must have leaked the story. Noble lady rescues wild pony from certain death. Within minutes, the stable yard was a circus. Charlotte heard them before she saw them. "Lady Whitmore," a voice called, cutting through the stable door. "How does it feel to be a hero?" Another voice. "Are you reopening the estate to the public?" And then the shouting started, questions flying, flashes popping through cracks in the old wood. Bee cursed softly, blocking the windows with burlap feed sacks. "Don't let them in," she said, her jaw set. "Just ignore them." But Charlotte couldn't ignore the pounding in her own head. She'd wanted nothing more than to disappear, to nurse her grief and guilt in private, to heal at her own pace. Now strangers were trampling all over her sanctuary, shouting her name, digging up her past. A reporter read out details about Edward, about the Lake District rescue, about her years at St. Bartholomew's, turning her tragedy into headlines. Windsor spooked at the noise, his head tossing, legs trembling. Charlotte sat with him, pressing her hand to his shoulder, murmuring soft words to drown out the chaos. "Easy, Windsor. They'll get bored and go away." She almost believed it, but the questions kept coming. One voice broke through the clamor. "Lady Whitmore, is it true you're selling the estate?" Charlotte's heart skipped. How did they know? Her private hell, the mounting debts, the unpaid taxes, the maintenance costs that swallowed every cent of her inheritance, was about to become public property. The thought sent her stomach twisting. She forced herself to stay calm. Bee handed her a phone, whispering, "It's James. He's outside. Wants to come in." Charlotte squeezed out a shaky breath and opened the back door, letting James slip inside with a duffel of fresh supplies. "Sorry for the scene," he said, giving her a sympathetic look. "Small towns. Everyone talks." James knelt by Windsor, checking his vitals, then shook his head. "He's fighting, but the infection's stubborn. I'll need to up the antibiotics and try a different regimen. I also brought some IV fluids. Might help keep him strong." Charlotte nodded, following every instruction. The rest of the world faded as they worked together, the three of them forming a small, desperate team. But the crisis outside pressed in. The estate's landline rang off the hook. Lawyers, creditors, relatives demanding answers. Lady Margaret called, her voice tight. "Charlotte, what is going on? There are reporters at my door in London. We cannot afford another scandal." Charlotte promised she'd handle it, even as her hands shook and her vision blurred. As evening fell, the press still lingered at the gates, some camping out with thermoses and folding chairs, waiting for their shot. Charlotte finally snapped, storming to the edge of the drive, her boots caked with mud, hair wild. "Leave us alone," she shouted, voice raw. "This is private property. Get off my land." A hush fell, cameras whirring. Then a few brave souls fired more questions. "Is it true you're broke? Are you really a hero or just desperate?" She wanted to scream, to run, to hide in the stables forever. Instead, she forced herself to walk back, spine stiff, jaw clenched. Bee waited by the door, handing her a damp cloth. "Let them say what they want," Bee said, eyes gentle. "You know the truth. Just focus on what matters." That night, Charlotte sat beside Windsor, tracing circles on his warm flank, listening to the distant murmur of the crowd outside the walls. Every part of her ached, from exhaustion, from old wounds, from the fear that this was all unraveling faster than she could hold together. She thought of the estate, her family legacy, slipping away piece by piece to cover debts she could barely admit existed. Windsor shivered, his breathing ragged. Charlotte pressed her forehead to his, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Please, Windsor, don't go. I need you. You're all I have left." The words felt strange, naked, as if she'd spoken them to herself. In the darkness, with hope as thin as candlelight, Charlotte made a silent vow. She would fight for Windsor, for the estate, for herself. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But tonight, in the battered old stable with the storm finally fading, she was still here, still standing, still refusing to give up. Night in the stables was thick and uneasy, the kind of dark that seemed to seep into Charlotte's bones. Every hour bled into the next as she kept her vigil by Windsor's side. The little light left flickering on her notepad filled with numbers, medicine doses, and notes scrawled in handwriting that grew less steady as exhaustion crept in. The press outside had dwindled for now, driven off by fatigue and rain, but Charlotte knew they'd return with the sunrise. It was only a brief, uneasy truce. Her sanctuary felt smaller, the weight of the estate's crisis pressing on her from every angle. Windsor's fever had spiked again at dusk. James had changed the antibiotics, explaining that sometimes it took a few tries to find what would work, but Charlotte could read the uncertainty in his eyes. By midnight, Windsor could barely stand, his sides shuddering with every breath. Charlotte lost track of how many times she'd changed the cold compresses or whispered to him in the dark, her voice hoarse and desperate. Bea had made her eat something, but the taste turned to ash in Charlotte's mouth. She watched Windsor struggle, helpless to stop the downward spiral. Every wheeze, every tremor of the pony's muscles made her chest ache. In the flickering lantern light, Windsor's eyes found hers, full of fear and a kind of trust that nearly undid her. "Don't leave me," she whispered, over and over, unsure if she was pleading with him or with some higher power she'd stopped believing in the night Edward died. As the hours stretched on, the memories became harder to fight. She saw herself kneeling in the snow in the Lake District, gloves red with her brother's blood, her voice raw from screaming for help that didn't come. The same helplessness threatened to pull her under now, tighter than the river's current. Windsor's pain echoed the pain that had lived in her since that night, and Charlotte's control began to crumble. At some point, the fever took a turn for the worse. Windsor collapsed with a guttural cry that shattered the hush, his legs folding awkwardly beneath him, sweat soaking his flanks. Charlotte dropped to her knees, heart in her throat, calling for Bea and James with a voice that broke on the syllables. Bea rushed over, checking Windsor's pulse, feeling his legs, shaking her head with a look Charlotte didn't want to read. "We're losing him," Bea said, voice taut. "Charlotte, I need your help, now." Training took over. Charlotte grabbed the IV, held Windsor's head steady, her hands slick with fear and memory. James injected another dose of antibiotics and adrenaline, his voice calm but urgent. For a moment, it was like being back in the trauma bay at St. Bartholomew's. Life and death balanced on the edge of a blade, every action critical. But here, it was so much more personal. The patient was not just a chart number. He was her last anchor in a world that had unraveled. Windsor's breathing became shallow, each rise of his chest slower than the last. Charlotte pressed her forehead to his, hot tears slipping down her cheeks, her body shaking with the force of her helplessness and anger. "You can't go, Windsor, you hear me? Not after all this. Please, stay with me." She screamed then. Not words, just rage and heartbreak. The pain of every loss she'd ever endured exploding out of her in the darkness. For a moment, there was only the sound of her voice and the frantic rhythm of Windsor's heart under her palm. She sobbed until she had nothing left. Her body slumped against the pony's neck, Bee's hand on her shoulder, James murmuring that they'd done all they could. But Charlotte wasn't ready to let go. Not this time. "No, don't!" she gasped, voice ragged. "He can't die! He can't—" But Windsor's breath was slipping away. The world seemed to narrow to a pinpoint of light and pain. Charlotte realized suddenly that she was alone, truly alone, if Windsor left her. The thought tore through her defenses. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone, worried but angry, of the reporters at the gates, the creditors' letters piling up, the way everyone had always looked to her to be strong. But she wasn't strong. Not anymore. Not like this. Something inside her cracked, and for the first time in years she admitted it, aloud to herself, to Bee, to James, to the dark stable and the world beyond. "I can't do this alone. Please, I need help." She reached for her phone with shaking fingers, dialing her mother before she could lose her nerve. The line rang and rang, then Lady Margaret's voice answered, clipped but worried. "Charlotte? What's happened?" "I need you," Charlotte choked out. I can't do this by myself. Windsor, he's dying. Please, bring whoever you can. Please, Mom. I need help." There was a stunned silence. Then Lady Margaret's voice softened in a way Charlotte hadn't heard since she was a child. "I'll be there," she promised. "Hang on, darling. I'm coming." Charlotte dropped the phone, her breath shuddering, the words echoing in her ears. "I need help." She'd said it. She'd finally said it. Bee squeezed her hand. "That's all any of us can do," she said quietly. "Ask for help. Let people in." In the stillness that followed, Windsor's breath evened out, just barely. Charlotte pressed her face to his warm, damp neck, whispering every hope and prayer she had left, promising him and herself that she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not when she'd finally learned the hardest lesson. That letting go of pride might just be the thing that saves you. And as the first light of dawn crept over the stables, Charlotte held on, refusing to surrender. To grief, to fear, to the darkness that had ruled her for too long. The world beyond the stable blurred into a dizzy carousel of phone calls, headlights sweeping through the early morning mist, and unfamiliar voices crossing the Whitmore estate's muddy drive. Charlotte barely registered how many people had come. Just that, suddenly, she was no longer alone in her vigil. Lady Margaret arrived in a flurry of expensive perfume and tailored coats, striding past the press with a regal glare that parted the crowd like the Red Sea. Behind her came Dr. Forrest, the family's private physician, followed by two veterinary specialists from London. One a professor, the other a young woman with a rolling medical cart in tow. Charlotte didn't know if it was her mother's money or her reputation that summoned them all. And in that moment, she didn't care. "Where is he?" Lady Margaret demanded, tossing her umbrella aside as if the storm itself was an inconvenience. Charlotte led the group into the stable, her relief so raw it left her shaking. The scent of antiseptic mingled with hay and sweat as the doctors and vets surrounded Windsor. They examined the pony with brisk, practiced movements, murmuring technical jargon, blood work, cultures, experimental treatments. Dr. Forrest glanced at Charlotte. "He's critical, but not beyond hope," he said. "We're going to do everything we can." James stood in the corner, hat in hand, quietly explaining Windsor's history to the specialists. Bea stayed by Charlotte's side, offering a quiet strength she never knew she needed. Lady Margaret pulled Charlotte into a rare, tight embrace, her eyes damp but shining with determination. "You did the right thing asking for help," she whispered. As the team set up IVs and diagnostic monitors, Charlotte stepped back, watching the stable transform into a medical triage unit. There was something almost holy about the scene, a coming together of skill, grit, and the kind of privilege that could open any door when it truly mattered. Charlotte found herself praying to whatever force might be listening that it would be enough. Then, as the commotion reached its peak, a new sound cut through the noise. A chorus of country voices, rough but determined. Outside, a group of locals stood at the fence, commoners whose families had grazed ponies here for generations. They came bearing buckets of fresh water, armfuls of hay, and bundles of herbs. At their head was Mrs. Rudd, a woman Charlotte vaguely remembered from her childhood, her voice booming as she addressed Lady Margaret and Charlotte. "That there pony belongs to the old Windsor line," Mrs. Rudd declared. "His blood's been running wild in these woods since before your people built that house. He's one of ours, too. Let us help." James stepped out, greeting the commoners like long-lost kin. There was a brief, awkward pause as centuries of class and tradition hovered in the air, but then Lady Margaret nodded. "You're welcome here," she said simply. And with that, the walls between aristocrat and commoner melted just a little. The hours blurred together as the professionals worked inside and the locals set up outside, repairing fences, cleaning stalls, bringing hot tea and fresh bread to anyone who needed it. The local priest even came by to say a quiet prayer over Windsor's stall, lighting a candle that flickered bravely in the draft. Inside, the mood swung from tension to hope and back again. The specialists started an aggressive new treatment, explaining every step to Charlotte, who listened with rapt, desperate attention. "We're going to try a plasma transfusion," the young vet said. "It's experimental, but it's his best chance." Charlotte nodded, eyes brimming with gratitude and terror all at once. She stood beside Windsor, stroking his sweat-damp neck, whispering to him through every injection and procedure. "You're not alone, Windsor," she promised, over and over. "You're not alone anymore." Bea took Charlotte's hand, squeezing it tight. "You did this," she said softly. "You brought everyone together. You gave him a chance." Outside, the press watched from a respectful distance now, their hunger for scandal dulled by the spectacle of so many working for something bigger than themselves. Reporters lowered their cameras as the commoners invited them to share tea and stories of the New Forest's wild ponies, stories of rescues, heartbreak, and redemption. It was as if the whole community had gathered for a single purpose. The treatment wore on, hour after hour. Charlotte found herself pacing, praying, crying, then laughing at small victories. A slight improvement in Windsor's pulse, a tiny nudge of his nose against her hand, a moment when his breathing eased just enough to give hope. The specialists monitored every change, adjusting medications, whispering updates. "He's responding," one said finally, a note of real hope in her voice. "He's not out of danger, but he's fighting. You gave him that." Lady Margaret watched her daughter with quiet pride. "I knew you'd find your way back," she said. "I only wish Edward could see you now." Charlotte smiled through tears, exhausted but alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. She realized, standing amid strangers and friends, doctors and country folk, that healing was never a solo act. The old walls of the Whitmore estate had held generations apart for too long, but now in the shadow of crisis, they'd become the foundation of something new, a place where help and hope could find a home. As night fell again, Windsor's fever finally broke. The vets and doctors cheered softly, the commoners clapped, and Charlotte knelt beside her battered, beautiful pony, whispering 1,000 thanks. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, it didn't feel like she was fighting alone. And as she drifted into a much-needed sleep, Charlotte knew she'd found a new kind of family, one forged not by blood, but by the wild, unlikely bond of second chances. By the time the autumn sun rose over the New Forest again, the Whitmore estate felt like a different place. The storm was only a memory, a shimmer of old pain clinging to the puddles drying in the morning light. Charlotte awoke on the stable's cot, her neck stiff and eyes sore, but her heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time since Edward's death, she'd slept without nightmares of mountains, rivers, and loss. Instead, her dreams had been filled with the sound of Windsor's steady breathing and the distant, hopeful voices of her new allies. Windsor was standing when she rose, his head high and ears forward, watching her with something almost like pride. The wound on his leg was clean, wrapped in a fresh dressing, and his coat shone where it wasn't still marred by the scars of the river. Charlotte's heart swelled. "Good morning, hero," she whispered, her voice catching. She fed him oats, letting her fingers linger in his warm, velvety muzzle, feeling a connection she hadn't dared believe possible. Lady Margaret appeared in the doorway, hair loose and eyes soft with fatigue and relief. "He's going to make it," she announced, as if the words themselves could guarantee it. Charlotte nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She wrapped her arms around her mother, and for once, there was no tension, no hidden reproach, just shared gratitude for the life that had been saved, and for the quiet, unexpected healing between them. Over the next days, the estate became a hive of gentle, purposeful activity. James and the vet specialists checked on Windsor every morning. Bea moved her laptop and paperwork into the kitchen, brewing endless pots of tea and sharing stories late into the night with Charlotte and Lady Margaret. Even the commoners stopped by, tending to fences and bringing apples for Windsor, who accepted their offerings with the dignity of royalty. Charlotte found herself transformed. The stables, once a place of ghosts and silence, now rang with laughter, the clang of tools, and the hoofbeats of new arrivals. Rescued ponies whose owners, inspired by the story in the press, had brought them seeking help. The estate's gates, once shut to keep the world at bay, were opened each morning to neighbors, schoolchildren, and volunteers who wanted to lend a hand. One afternoon, as Charlotte helped a young girl brush out the mane of a rescued foal, Bea leaned in with a knowing smile. "You did this," she said. "You took your pain and turned it into a place where others can heal too." Charlotte looked around, hardly recognizing the woman she'd become. The estate's finances, once a looming disaster, had found relief from donations, fundraising, and the growing support of the local community. Lawyers and accountants came and went, working with Lady Margaret to restructure what could be saved. Charlotte, freed from the constant dread of losing her family's legacy, found herself dreaming bigger than she ever had before. At Bea's urging, Charlotte returned to medicine, but not as the hard-edged A&E consultant she'd been in London. Instead, she bought a battered van, fitting it out as a mobile medical unit. She and Bea began serving the rural villages of Hampshire, providing checkups, first aid, and health education to families who'd been overlooked for years. The work felt honest, grounded, and more fulfilling than any emergency room could ever be. The sanctuary for New Forest ponies took shape in the old paddocks, each new rescue a testament to the power of hope. Local schools sent children to learn about the land and the animals, and Charlotte found herself telling stories of resilience and redemption. Her own story, Windsor's story, and the story of everyone who had ever faced the river and survived. One golden afternoon, as she stood by Windsor's paddock, watching him trot with a growing herd of once-lost ponies, Charlotte heard laughter echoing across the grass. Lady Margaret and James sat with Bee and several commoners beneath the great oak tree, sharing food and memories as equals, not as aristocrats and villagers. The estate, for so long a symbol of separation, had become a meeting place, a bridge between old world and new. Charlotte closed her eyes and breathed in the scents of cut grass and wildflowers, the distant sound of hooves, and the murmur of contentment. She felt Edward's presence, not as a wound, but as a gentle blessing, a voice in the breeze reminding her that courage and kindness never truly die. That evening, as the sun slipped behind the trees, Charlotte led Windsor to the barn, rubbing his nose and whispering, "Thank you for saving me too." He nudged her shoulder in reply, his trust as solid as the earth beneath their feet. Later, Charlotte sat in her father's old study, writing letters to donors and making notes for the next week's medical run. She paused to look at a photo of Edward, still young and laughing, arms slung around her shoulders. She smiled, sadness and gratitude mingling in her chest. She had finally found a way to carry him forward, not as a burden, but as a light. It wasn't a return to who she'd been before the storm. It was a transformation, a new life grown from the wreckage, richer and more real than anything she'd imagined. She had become a healer not just of bodies, but of hearts, families, and a community she'd almost forgotten how to love. Charlotte gazed out at the moonlit fields and the gentle silhouettes of ponies grazing in the dark. She understood at last that true nobility wasn't about titles or birthright, but about service, sacrifice, and the courage to begin again. The estate, Windsor, her family, and her own battered spirit, all redeemed not by miracles, but by choosing each day to reach out instead of turning away. And in that moment, with the world quiet and whole, Charlotte knew that second chances weren't given. They were earned. Together. The New Forest, with its endless stretch of ancient oaks and wild, dappled light, had become something new to Charlotte. A landscape of healing, a place where pain and hope could share the same soil. The years that followed Windsor's rescue carried her and the estate further from the night of that storm, but she never forgot what the river had taken, or what it had returned. Autumn painted the land in gold and fire, ponies wandering the pastures, children's laughter ringing from the old stables now bustling with life. Visitors called Charlotte the Pony Lady of Hampshire, a title that made her smile each time she heard it. She wore it proudly, not as a shield, but as a badge of honor. Windsor, gray beginning to creep into his mane, remained at her side, the living heart of the sanctuary, a survivor and a symbol. People came from across the country, not just to see the horses, but to hear the story that had captured headlines and changed lives. On the anniversary of Windsor's rescue, the sanctuary held a festival, welcoming families, villagers, and city folk alike. There were hay rides and local food, music beneath the great oak, and at dusk, Charlotte stood by Windsor's paddock, watching the children feed him apples and braid flowers into his forelock. Lady Margaret, elegant and unhurried, moved among the guests with the air of someone who'd found peace after a long, hard journey. James brought his own children, who darted between the horses, shrieking with laughter, Even Bea and her wife had traveled down from London, sharing stories with the locals as if they'd always belonged. As darkness fell, Charlotte gathered everyone around the fire. She told the tale again, how a wild pony in a storm had forced her to confront her greatest fear, how she'd learned that real strength came from admitting weakness, that true healing began the day she let people in. She spoke of Edward, her brother's memory woven into every decision, every rescue, every moment she chose compassion over pride. There was silence as she finished, a quiet that held not sadness, but understanding. A sense that everyone there, in their own way, carried burdens they'd never spoken aloud. Later, when the guests had gone and the estate was peaceful once more, Charlotte wandered the grounds. She paused at Edward's old treehouse, still standing in the dusk. She climbed the weathered ladder and sat among the branches, legs dangling, heart full. For so long, grief had been a cage, a private darkness she'd refused to leave. Now it felt like a room with windows thrown open, a place she could visit but no longer had to live inside. Windsor grazed below, a gentle silhouette in the moonlight. Charlotte watched him and thought of all the broken things she'd tried to fix, the estate, the family legacy, the lives she'd saved and lost. She realized now that not everything could be repaired, and that was all right. What mattered was the willingness to keep trying, to keep reaching for something better, even after failure and heartbreak. In her work with the mobile medical unit, Charlotte had come to see suffering in all its shapes. She treated old men with failing hearts, children with scraped knees, mothers with haunted eyes. She listened as people told her about their own storms, their own rivers. Every patient reminded her of Windsor, hurt, frightened, but ready to fight if only someone reached out a hand. The greatest lesson, Charlotte saw, was that trauma could destroy or transform. Privilege, her family name, her mother's influence, had built walls around her, but those same resources, used humbly, could become bridges. She learned to ask for help and to give it freely, no matter how proud or broken someone appeared. The New Forest itself seemed to whisper the truth. Wild things are not meant to be conquered, but respected. Some scars would never fade. Some nights, Charlotte still woke from dreams of rivers and loss, her heart pounding. But the difference now was that she had company in the dark. Windsor, Lady Margaret, Bea, James, the commoners, and everyone the sanctuary had drawn close. They were a patchwork family, stitched together by second chances. One chilly evening, as Charlotte locked up the barn, a teenage girl approached her, leading a battered bay pony whose eyes were full of the same defiance Charlotte had once seen in Windsor. The girl's hands shook as she spoke. "They said you could help him," she whispered. Charlotte smiled, kneeling to meet the pony's gaze. "We'll do our best," she said. "He's in the right place now." It struck her then that the estate's true legacy wasn't the land, or the title, or the money. It was the steady accumulation of small kindnesses, of wounds tended and wrongs made right, of pride surrendered in favor of hope. The estate, the sanctuary, her work, it all existed because Charlotte had let herself be saved as much as she'd tried to save others. Standing by the barn, Charlotte looked up at the stars. She felt the fullness of her journey, the mistakes and the grace, the letting go and the holding on. She hoped that anyone struggling through their own dark night, anyone wrestling with guilt or loss, might take comfort in Windsor's story, and in hers. Sometimes the world offered you a second chance, not in a blaze of glory, but in the soft, persistent light of ordinary days. Sometimes the wildest storms left behind the greenest fields. And sometimes, healing was simply the courage to ask for help, to accept love, and to begin again, no matter how many times you'd fallen. As Charlotte Whitmore, the pony lady of Hampshire, walked back through the quiet yard, she knew her story, Edward's story, Windsor's story, and all the stories that would follow were woven together now, forever. And that, she thought, was more than enough.